Hello and welcome back to the Golden Eagle Luxury Trains YouTube channel. I'm delighted today to be joined by Major Gordon Corrigan, MBE, who's sitting down with us to answer questions submitted by your wonderful selves. So Gordon, I'll begin with question 1. Aside from the architecture, are there any remaining distinctions between East and West Berlin and Germany?
There are, even after 32 years after reunification. Initially, to unify the country, East and West, cost the West German government a huge amount because the East mark was worth nothing like the West mark. The official rate was something like 4-1. When I was stationed in Berlin, one could get 8 East marks for 1 West mark quite easily. But the West German government took the view that they had to exchange it 1-1. Now, they had to do that because if they didn't, they would destroy all the savings of everybody in East Germany, and the Easterners wouldn't be at all happy. So it cost a huge amount just to unify the country. Even now, there are still considerable differences. In East Germany, you still see wasteland covered in weeds. You don't see that in West Germany. You see shops boarded up. You don't see that in West Germany. And there's quite a political difference. There's a resurgence of right-wing politics in Eastern Germany, not so much in the West. Alternative for Germany, AfD, is the rising right-wing party. Now, by our standards, it's actually not that right-wing. But of course, the Germans are terrified of anything that looks at all like Nazism. AfD are nothing like Nazism, but they are on the right, and it's in the East that their main support comes. So there are actually quite a lot of differences. The roads are still not as good in the East as they were in the West. There's tremendous efforts on the part of the German government, which is now, of course, back in Berlin, trying to rectify this. I mean, they want the roads to be just as good in the East as they are in the West and all the rest of it. But they've still got quite a long way to go. And it's not because they're inefficient or lazy or can't be bothered. It's simply the huge cost of unification or reunification in the first place. Berlin, not so noticeable. There were great efforts because Berlin was the old capital, the historic capital, and was going to be the capital again. So there were huge efforts to improve the eastern bit, which again had been under the communists, had been neglected. The Brandenburg Gate, of course, that great symbol of Berlin, was in East Berlin. So it's not so noticeable in Berlin, although certain checkpoint Charlie, which is one of the main checkpoints where you could go through from West Berlin to East Berlin, they've kept that as a memento, and a bit of the Berlin Wall is still kept up, but that's as a sort of memorial to those who died trying to get across it. So yeah, there still are quite a lot of differences.
Okay, and then question 2. You've spoken and written so extensively and eloquently throughout your career. Do you still find yourself uncovering new facts or interesting information when preparing for a new novel or lecture?
Well, now, the first thing I have to say very firmly is that I don't write novels. I've never written a novel, and I don't think I'd be capable of writing a novel. I write history. Now, there are people who write both history and fiction. Even if I could write fiction, I wouldn't, because I think there's a danger there where people read a novel and they think, well, he's making that up. What else is he making up? So I keep well away from novels. And I also am very careful not to read any fiction. I don't read a lot of fiction, but the fiction I do read, I make sure it's nothing to do with what I do professionally. And the reason for that is, if you ask me a question and I give you an answer, now, did I get that from the Admiralty records, or did I get it from Patrick O'Brien or whatever? I was asked to review one of Patrick O'Brien's books as a historian to say how accurate it was historically, and it was brilliant. I'd love to read all 30 or whatever it is. I daren't. When I retire, if I ever do, I shall read them then. And similarly, Bernard Cornwell, his books about the Peninsular War, and I did review one of those, and I thought it was brilliant, but I daren't read the rest. So I'm nothing to do with novels. But yeah, I mean, every historian is hoping to find something that nobody else has ever looked at, and is going to completely change everybody's view of what happened. I have only once found something that nobody else looked at, and that really didn't make any difference to the course of events. But it was when I was writing my book on the 100 Years' War, and the sources for the 100 Years' War are either in Middle English, which is Chaucer's English. Now, Old English is German. If you speak German, Old English is no problem. Chaucer's English, if you've got a bit of German and you don't worry about the spelling, that's not difficult. You know, you can understand that. Norman French is the other source. My French is quite good. Norman French is not that different from Norman French. That was fine. Latin, a lot of the sources are in Latin, and I thought, well, I've got an O-level in Latin, shouldn't be any problem. Mind you, my O-level was a long time ago. But the trouble was that medieval Latin had punctuations and ways of expressing things, conventions that weren't taught to schoolboys when I was a schoolboy. So, but my wife is a medievalist. Her Latin's a lot better than mine, so she could help quite a bit. But I managed to find translations of most of the stuff I wanted to read. And there was a thing called the Chronicle of Lanercost. Now, in 1347, after the French had had a kicking by the English at the Battle of Crecy, 1346, their allies, the Scots, the French said to the Scots, look, for God's sake, do something to distract the English. So King David of Scotland thought, whoopee, all the English soldiers will be in France. This is the time. And they went bowling down the Roman road and through Lanercost. Lanercost is on the Scottish border. And there was a priory there. And a monk in the priory wrote an account of what happened, a contemporary account. We don't know what his name is. We just know he was a monk. In fact, of course, all the English soldiers weren't in France because King Edward had taken no soldiers from north of the Trent. So in fact, the poor old Scots got their head kicked in just north of Durham, and King David went into the Tower and stayed there for years. Didn't make any difference to Scotland. They carried on perfectly well without their king. But I wanted to read what the contemporary Chronicle of Lanercost said about this particular Scots invasion. And I managed to find a translation which had been written in about 1904 by a professor. And it was wonderful because it had the English on one side and the Latin on the other. So I was able to work through this. And it came to one bit which said, the following bit is so disgusting, I am not prepared to reproduce it or translate it. So there's this great gap. So I thought, right. So off I go to the British Library, clutching my Latin dictionary and Kennedy's Latin primer and everything else. And I said, could I see the Lanercost Chronicle, please? Now, we are very lucky in the UK. The National Archives in Kew, the British Library next to St Pancras Station, whatever you want, whether it was something produced 500, 1,000 years ago, if it was written, it'll be there. And within 15, 20 minutes, you've got it. So I said, could I see the Lanercost Chronicle, please? And so the original Lanercost Chronicle is brought out, written in 1347. And the bit, and I think I can, I know I've probably got families watching this, but I think I can tell you what it said. And what it said, the bit that the professor would not repeat, it said that every time King David of Scotland passed a church, he went in and defecated in the font. Now, I'm quite sure he didn't, because the Scots were just as hag-ridden by religion as the English were. But it does indicate what the monk of Lanercost felt about the Scots. And of course, if every time the Scots crossed the border and they killed your pigs, drank your wine, burnt your priory down, you wouldn't like them very much. But it was interesting that was felt then, and this was an academic document, it wasn't sort of something to the public, that it was felt that they couldn't repeat it. And the difference there, so I of course did publish it in my book. If you go on 10 years, when I was writing my book about the Indian Corps on the Western Front in the First World War, and I wanted to see what the local population thought about Indians in England, because remember, then, unless you lived in a port, you never saw a coloured face. You never saw a black face, brown face. There just weren't any. So here is the Indian military hospital in Brighton. I mean, there were several Indian military hospitals in the Brighton area, where wounded Indians and Gurkhas were sent back from the Western Front to be looked after. And I wanted to see what the public thought of them. So I went to Colindale, the British Newspaper Library, another wonderful institution. I mean, if you want to see tracts published during the English Civil War, they've got them. So I got out all the local newspapers, the Lewis Chronicles and everything else, working out what they thought of Indians. And they thought very highly of them, actually. They thought they were well-behaved and smart and all the rest of it. And I came across, and this happens when you're researching, you find something that has absolutely nothing to do with what you're supposed to be researching. And I came across an account of a parlour maid, who'd taken out a paternity order against her employer, the vicar. And I thought, oh, this is interesting, scandalous. And of course, I'd get the next week's ones, what happened? And this went on for several weeks, quite a long trial. And in it, the details were such that you wouldn't get away with it now, actually. If you published now what the local newspapers, reports of the trial, then if you publish that today, you'd be done under the Obscene Publications Act. So they've gone from 1904, can't say anything like that, to 10 years later, or 11 years later, actually 1915, publishing the most scandalous details of the cross-examination of the girl and all the rest of it. Needless to say, in a day before DNA and everything else, she lost. They took the vicar's word before hers. I reckon, actually, he was guilty as hell, but I don't know. I wasn't on the jury. But it just shows you the difference in opinions, how in 10 years, how so much had changed. So going back to the original question, one's always hoping to find something original. Interestingly, people who do medieval history at our local university, Kent University, just down the road from me, when part of the module, of course, is Latin, because they've got to be able to read medieval sources. And they go into the cathedral archives, where there is a pile of documents which haven't been looked at since they were written, probably. Haven't been looked at since 1200. And you take the first one off the pile. And of course, everybody is hoping they're going to find something absolutely extraordinary, proving that Henry VIII had no right to the throne or whatever. In fact, most of them are laundry lists or charters, land grants and that sort of thing. But hope springs eternal. They're always hoping to find something. So we all do that. The fun, actually, in being a historian is in the research. The writing is pretty easy. Once you've got your facts, once you've been to the sources, you've got your facts. Writing it is no problem. But the research is great because you're looking at something that possibly people have looked at before, but have they looked at it from a particular angle or whatever? So it's great fun.
I can imagine your monk would be quite dismayed if he was to see the obscenities that are published in today's press and social media. Our third question: what has been your favourite Golden Eagle luxury train journey over the years?
It's quite difficult to answer because I've actually enjoyed them all. I suppose the very first one I did, which was, of course, Trans-Siberian, from Moscow to Vladivostok and back again. And that was wonderful. Bear in mind that because of my security vetting when I was in the army, even if I left the army for a number of years, I wasn't permitted to go to an ex-communist country. So I couldn't go to Russia. And of course, once that ban was lifted, once I'd been out long enough for anything I knew to be obsolete, then of course I could go. So it was fascinating to go and to see the differences in this vast country. And that I've done the Trans-Siberian numerous times, and I've always found, seen something different each time. It's a great shame what's happening at the moment, because I got to quite like the Russians, actually. They're very suspicious people. I mean, they take a long time to accept you, but once they do accept, and once they accept and realize that I wasn't a spy, and the fact that I was an ex-army officer was nothing to do with it, they're great. And I have to be slightly careful what I say, because I don't know who in Russia is seeing this. Simpler to say that a lot of people I know in Russia when the war in Ukraine first started, emailed me to say, this is not for us, we don't agree with this. One person emailed me and said, I'm ashamed of my country. And I emailed back and said, you don't know who's listening, be careful. It's a great shame. And of course, if the war stopped tomorrow, I don't think anyone would want to go back to Russia for a long time. And that is very sad, because that certainly was a wonderful tour. I've always enjoyed going to Mongolia. Again, my first time, they said, can you ride? And I said, yeah. I said, what I do when I'm not working. Would you want to ride one of our horses? Oh, yes. And they produced this tiny little thing, which is about 12 hands high. I mean, it was a pony. And I got on it, and my feet were almost on the ground. And I thought, is this up to my weight? I mean, I'm 12 stone. And the chap said, oh, yeah, go on. So I trotted it for a bit. And then I cantered, and I went at a gallop, and I galloped it for about half a mile, and it pulled up. It wouldn't have blown a candle. And then I realized, of course, these are the animals that Genghis Khan's Mongols conquered the whole of Europe on these little animals. So that was fun. I think the one that not concerned me, but was interesting was the first time I went on the Golden Eagle to Iran. Now, they don't like the British terribly in Iran. We're the little Satan. America's the big Satan. So what I did was, my father was an accountant, and he was working in Ireland, and I was born in Ireland. So I thought, the passport of an innocuous nation that nobody dislikes would be useful. So I applied for and got an Irish passport. So, in fact, I needn't have worried, because the people we met, people in Iran, are lovely. I mean, they're jolly nice, young, well-educated, Western-looking people ruled by a medieval theocracy. I mean, it is extraordinary. And we found the people were nice. There were certain regulations. I mean, even stopped at a railway station, our girls, they had to cover their heads and this sort of thing. But that seemed to be relaxing while we were there. And it was interesting too that in a lot of the areas, even rural areas, that signposts were in Farsi, which is the local language, and English. And of course, that goes way back to a period when Russia and England divided Persia between them, effectively. So that was fascinating, because I didn't really know what to expect with Iran, having never been there before. And that was interesting. I mean, they're all put me against a wall and nail me to a wall and say, what is your favorite? You're going to do one more. It would probably be or indeed the Silk Road. That's wonderful. I mean, if you're brought up on stirring tales that won the empire and the great game, then that's the place to be, because all these places that one read about as a child and had this sort of tremendous romantic allure, Samarkand, and all the rest, these are fascinating places. So they're all, I can't imagine that any Golden Eagle trips are not fascinating. I mean, Tibet was fascinating going there. Now, of course, we couldn't get the Golden Eagle to Tibet, so we took a Chinese train, which was not as comfortable as Golden Eagle, but it was very good. And I was wandering around Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and I heard a conversation in Nepali. Now, I speak Nepali because my service was in a Gurkha regiment where the soldiers are Gurkhas, Nepalis. And I went around the corner, and here were these two Tibetans. They weren't Gurkhas. And I went up to them in Nepali, and I said, how is it you speak Nepali? And they didn't. When I realized I wasn't Chinese, it turned out that these two characters were smugglers, and they smuggled things from Nepal up to Tibet. And therefore they had to speak Nepali, dealing with the smugglers, the Nepali smugglers. And they said, we speak in Nepali because the Chinese can't understand us, so they don't know what we're saying. And I said, well, be careful. It wouldn't be too difficult for the Chinese to learn Nepali. But I did learn a great deal from these two, which, of course, you don't get from the official guides who have to be careful what they say because the Chinese are listening. And the Chinese in Tibet are trying to eliminate all Tibetan influence. I mean, the Chinese language, they're pushing that. They haven't closed down all the temples because they just couldn't get away with that, but quite a few they have. The Tibetans are allowed to revere all the Dalai Lamas up to the present one, who I think is the 13th, I'm not sure. They can't mention him, can't have pictures of him or anything like that. He, of course, is down in India, having fled in 1959. So again, that's interesting. They're all interesting. I've enjoyed them all.
Now, I imagine this might relate back to something you just said. Is there any period in history that you've studied that you'd wish to live in, or maybe simply to go back in time and visit briefly?
I often thought I wish I'd been born in 1860, because that would have allowed me in 1880 to be commissioned into the British Indian Army. And of course, that was a time when the empire was at its full strength, when whatever initial money-making ideas had gone. I mean, the empire was there for the benefit of its population, as Disraeli made very clear. There was lots to do. There were still parts of the world that were unexplored. There was lots of active service from India up on the northwest frontier, northeast frontier, Burma, India's near abroad, lots to do. But it was still a period when medical science was reasonably adapted, reasonably modern. So if you got wounded, you had a fair chance of survival. So I'd like to have lived in that period. I would also have liked to have spent a bit of time with Wellington's army. Now, the interesting, from a historian's point of view, the great thing about Wellington's army and Peninsular War period was that soldiers were literate. Now, if you go before that, if you go back 100 years to Marlborough, then officers wrote accounts of battles and campaigns, but soldiers didn't. Well, there were a few exceptions, but in general, soldiers weren't literate, or if they were, they didn't write accounts. By the time you move on to the early 19th century, sort of 1800 onwards, soldiers are literate, or many of them are. So you get a really good idea of what life was like, not just from officers, not just from people at the top, but the people at the bottom as well. And it was a very professional army. I mean, it consistently beat far larger French armies because it was a professional army. It was the only regular army. Everybody else, their army was conscripted. It consisted of conscripts. Some of the officers, some of the senior NCOs were full-time professionals, but mainly it was a conscript army. And the British Army wasn't. It was a professional army. So that would have been fun. I'd quite like to have travelled with Henry V in France on the way to Agincourt. Now, the only trouble then, of course, is that medical science was not at all advanced. And if you got wounded, there was a fair chance you'd probably snuff it. So that might be a bit dodgier. But the interesting thing about that period, we're going back early 15th century, late 14th, early 15th century, was it was a period of tremendous social mobility. In other words, there are cases of a private soldier, an archer, who does well, gets promoted to Vingtenar, which was a rank where he commanded 20, sort of small platoon commander, if you like. And if he did well there, he became a centenar, commanding 100, so he's a company commander. And some of them ended up commanding armies, being ennobled, being entitled, and of course, the reverse could happen. If you didn't do well, down you came. But you got advancement by your military ability, rather like the Junker system in Prussia, where you got Junker status, aristocracy status by military service. So that would have been, I've always admired Henry V. I think he's one of the greatest Englishmen ever. I mean, it's a pity he died so young. Slaughterer of the French nobility, accepted regent of France and would have become king of France when Charles died, and of course he himself, Henry V, died very young. His son was a child, and then that leads into eventually the Wars of the Roses, those awful dynastic struggles, which end up with the Tudor monarchy. So those are sort of three periods that I'd really like to go back and have a look. I'd like to live in the old British Indian Army and visit the Peninsular Army, and perhaps spend a little bit of time there with Wellington, whom I think is England's greatest general. Wellington, wonderful chap. And I'd like to have a look but avoid being wounded at Henry V.
Now, you must forgive me in being a bit self-indulgent when picking this question. What do you enjoy most about travelling with Golden Eagle luxury trains?
There's lots of really, I mean, the food's great, and the service is excellent. It's all very, very comfortable. But I think that really, from my point of view, the best thing is the people you travel with, because the guests, you get a very broad section of people, all with different experiences. They've done different things. They're all interesting. They tend to be English speakers. So it tends to be British, Canadians, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, Scandinavians, who speak far better English than we do. We did on one occasion have a group of Taiwanese who went around giving everybody a little book saying, we are not Chinese, we are Taiwanese. They didn't speak a word of English. They came to all of my lectures, sat there, listening to everything, and I don't think they understood a word I said. But it's mainly English speakers, and they're all interesting people. You know, it's a great sort of camaraderie, because you're all on the train. I mean, you get off most days and go and look at something, come back, but we're all living together, and the having a drink in the bar before dinner is always fun. Dinner the food is excellent, but it's very informal. People can sit where they like, sit with whomsoever they like. I find that it's not a criticism, but I find that the food is so good and there's so much of it. I avoid having lunch, because if you ate everything, you would end up looking like a Michelin man and get far too fat. So, I mean, there's all sorts of wonderful things about it. I think people who've been on a sleeper in the UK, where you have to walk 2 carriages to get to the lavatory, and of course, Golden Eagle, the whole thing is en suite. So you've got your cabin, table, chair, bed, everything folds away, of course, and you've got your own shower, lavatory, wash basin, and whatnot. So it's completely self-contained. And should you want a cup of tea at 3 o'clock in the morning, I wouldn't dream of upsetting them, of getting the staff out of bed. But I mean, you can do that. If you suddenly couldn't sleep and you wanted a cup of tea, well, they'll do it. And the staff, people look after you, are great. I mean, they really are. So it's, I think it's a wonderful system, absolutely wonderful. But the most interesting thing for me is the people one travels with.
And our final question for you today: what can we expect from your lectures on the Eastern Europe Discovery Voyage?
What I will be doing is talking about the areas that we're in. So my lectures I'll try and be relevant to what's happening in a particular country that we're in. What is important, I find, is that you can be the greatest expert in the world on something, but if you can't put it across, you're wasting your time. And there are many people who are wonderful experts, and you just go to sleep because they're boring. So I hope to be informative, to be academically credible, but at the same time entertaining. So I will be trying very hard to make sure people go to sleep. And the important thing, of course, when lecturing, is to not be too complicated and not be too simple. So you've got to strike a balance that your audience can take in and can understand. So I'll be talking about the areas we're in, a bit about history, a bit about culture, a bit about what happens. And I hope to not only to inform, but to entertain. That really is my aim, and I hope it'll work.
Well, on behalf of all of us at Golden Eagle Luxury Trains, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to answer our questions and join us today, Gordon, and we greatly look forward to joining you on the Eastern Europe Discovery Voyage in September 2024.